There is a sense within the exhibition, and I think that perhaps one of the detracting criticisms that I don't necessarily ascribe to is that the human element of the face of war is somehow silent here. It's not as, I mean, you have Don McCullen in here, and you have a number of Japanese photographers that sort of showcase the human element of pain and suffering, mostly in books, from what I saw. Do you feel that, there's sort of a two-part question, I guess. One, that by taking the human element out, or at least reducing the human element, and whether or not that was conscious or not, that lowers the impact of what we're looking at in a way, to sort of make it less human feel. And two, second part to that, the stand-in for the human could be seen from my perspective as the scarred landscapes, Sophie Ristelweber in particular. So can you talk a little bit about the lack of let's say human face in the exhibition itself?
Well, I don't think that human face is missing. I think it's in proportion in a way to, as you said, landscape. And I think these are the two ways that that photographers have approached this question of how do you make work after something has happened? How do you look back? And this is the question of the show. How do you look back? And maybe the sort of iconic first image for this solution to this problem is Roger Fenton, the famous photograph of the
Valley of the Shadow of Death.
Valley of the Shadow of Death in the Crimean War. So he arrives, he finds this famous battlefield, and obviously it's 2 months after the end of the battle. There are no dead bodies, there are no survivors, there's nothing. There's just some cannonballs. And according to popular law, although we're not really sure exactly how this happened, but there are 2 photographs of the same valley, one with all the cannonballs kind of lying in a nice neat line, and the other way it looks like someone has scattered them around. And I think this solution, Fenton's solution, which is to say, it didn't really look enough like something had happened, so we need to be a bit more creative. It was a super interesting one. And then if you trace that idea, you see it going in different directions. You see a very poetic sense. And in fact, the Barnard images of the American Civil War are really interesting, because in some cases they're just empty sites where something happened. In other cases, he has people sitting quite reflectively, kind of contemplating ruins, almost in a sort of Baroque way, like kind of Piranesi. There's like a little boy sitting on a pile of rubble. And I think this, and the same with the Rouse album, you have images of utter devastation, then you have other ones where you have like the Archbishop standing in the cathedral on a pile of rubble. And I think these 2 options, which is trying to humanize it or trying to let the landscape speak in some way, they're things that have obsessed photographers. They've tried to take both routes, try to explore both routes. But the other one of taking the human idea of ruination is a much more complicated one. I think it was Tomatsu who said that until he went to Nagasaki, he said he thought that ruins could only be ascribed to buildings, and then he realized it could also be used to describe people. And I think the idea of ruined people is something that it's so much harder to photograph. It's so much harder to engage with. And the works in the show that are really intensely moving, a lot of them are those ones where you have the figure, you have the person. And Taran Simon's work about Srebrenica is an incredible work where you have just the remains of people standing in for them in a family tree, or Stephen Shaw's recent work in the Ukraine where you have these last living survivors. And he was very interested in this idea of the final generation who had experienced the mass extermination of Jewish people in the Second World War, of finding those last people and photographing them as they are now, not really as ruins, but as incredible direct kind of conduits of memory. And I think the show reflects the balance of what photographers do. I don't think it's that we deliberately went around trying to find depopulated photographs, or that we sort of looked at people's work and thought, there's people in there, let's not include it. I think there are an enormous number of other projects that just deal with landscape that we didn't include. In fact, there are many, 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 many photographers working with landscape and memory, and photographing just the spaces where things happen. which is has been for many years a kind of really strong kind of part of photographic practice. But I think the figure needs to be there as well. It needs to be there in interesting ways.